Some people are drifting in the direction we looked at last week of angelic worship, for lack of a better way to put it. For some reason, they're worshiping angels, and they think angels they're it. They're the ones. And I was trying to speculate as to why, and maybe it's because of the hardships that they're going through. They feel like, hey, aren't angels supposed to help us out or protect us? Let's, help me. But they're overlooking Jesus in this. And that's what our preacher's point is. Angels are not superior to Jesus, which is what they tend to think. Today, we're going to see another individual that they think is superior to Jesus, which is Moses. And it's quite striking why they would do this. But apparently, this congregation gets what I call all cattywampus about Jesus for some reason. And cattywampus is a important theological term, I'm sure, somewhere. I'm sure Martin Luther probably coined it. But before we read, though, the preacher's words to the people about the mistaken notion of Moses being superior to Jesus and so forth, I want to address just for a second, well, longer than a second, how easy it can be to misunderstand Jesus. And I'm helped by this by an author named Mike Cosper. He does this little deal about the Apostle Peter. And he notes how Peter just seemed to not quite understand Jesus. And Peter's story, I think, is a lot like what we're going to see the Hebrews story being like. Some of you may recall there was a moment where Jesus pulls his disciples aside and he says, hey, who do people think that I am? And they give all these answers. Some people think you're Elijah, you're a prophet, you're this or that. And then finally he says, well, who do you guys think I am? And you may remember this, Peter steps right up and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. I mean, you can't get better answer than that. You're the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus says, yep, that's it. You got it. But then Jesus goes on to tell his disciples that being who he is even, he will be crucified on a cross, but he will rise from the dead. And you may remember, Peter does not take well to this moment, and he rebukes Jesus. Don't talk like this. This is unacceptable for somebody of your stature to be saying things like this. That's not going to happen. I won't let it happen. And then Peter gets a rebuke from Jesus. Anybody remember the line that Jesus speaks back to Peter? Get behind me, Satan. Man, that's some strong language, right? And then Jesus goes on to say, Peter, you do not understand God's will. You're not understanding. And then he actually drops another line. He says, you are seeing things from the wrong point of view. Okay? So that's possible. Even for someone who confesses, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. They might know the answer, but something's not going on in the noggin. You understand what I'm saying? Or the heart or whatever. Sometimes I know who you are. But do you? Do you really? And that's what we need to think about when it comes to Peter. So Peter, in other situations, he seems to try to understand who Jesus is, but sometimes he keeps objecting to the things that Jesus does or the things that Jesus says, right? You may remember one time he refused to let Jesus wash his feet. No, you're not touching me, he said. That's unacceptable. Messiahs don't wash feet. Slaves? Yeah. Messiahs? No. And then Jesus has to go, hey, I don't wash your feet, you're not with me. And he's like, well, dang, right? So Peter seems to hear things that Jesus speaks, sees the things that Jesus does, but somehow Peter seems to be listening to a story he's telling himself about Jesus in his own head. And this is really important to understand. And one time he would say, I think I know you well enough, I would never, ever fall away from you. I know what's going on here. But then, of course, there's this moment where Jesus gets arrested, and then someone recognizes Peter with Jesus and says, hey, aren't you one of the followers? Anybody remember what happens in that moment? He denies knowing Jesus. Not once, twice, but 3 different times he denies him, right? And he'll say to this person who asked him, do you know that guy, right? And he says, I don't know who you're speaking of. That's good, isn't it? So Mike Cosper has this observation about this, and I think it's kind of brilliant. He says, maybe Peter is both a coward in that moment and yet telling the truth in that moment.